Well, thank you all for coming. You're a very brave bunch. I thought I'd be talking to one other person, so I'm amazed. Thank you. Very good. Well done. You all get a gold star. Great. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk just a little bit about an overview of ADHD, some of the recent science around ADHD. It's not meant to be a comprehensive overview, highly selective, but just a bit of a flavour of what we and other people are doing in the field. So all of this work is funded by NIH. It's funded by two institutes, NHGRI, the Genome Institute, and the National Institutes of Mental Health, which means that you all fund this work, so thank you very much. And I have no conflicts of interest. I have no ties to anything beyond NIH. So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today I'll talk a little bit about what is ADHD, which I'm sure a lot of you will know, so I won't spend too long on that. Then just a little bit about what studying the brain in ADHD can tell us about it, what it can, and also perhaps what it can tell us about ADHD. And then another thing I'll touch upon a little bit is how ADHD impacts on peer relationships. Whenever you hear scientists like me talk about ADHD, you'd be forgiven for thinking that we think of children as a series of little neural and genetic events that happen in a vacuum. We really don't. We know that children are embedded in lots of different contexts. They live in families, they have friends, and those friends, they're part of broader societal contexts. So just to start off, I'll just, by way of introduction, tell you about two kids who are in our study. Now, every Friday, I am in the clinical centre at NIH with my team. I'm a psychiatrist. And here, with my team, who are absolutely lovely, we work with families that are affected by ADHD. So we see kids and we see their parents, and we speak to their teachers. And these are two sort of typical kids that we would see. So the first little boy, let's call him Peter. So Peter, incredibly restless, his very exhausted mother came in. So to describe this child who'd been doing somersaults in the womb and had never stopped since, she just said, I'm just exhausted with the boy. And the room that we assess children in has got a chair that looks a little bit like those ones, but with a somewhat bigger gap between the head of the chair and the bottom of the chair. And within milliseconds, he had managed to get his head stuck in it. So we extracted him from it, and then he ran off. He found a power socket and was sort of playing with that. So we managed to, and this poor kid managed to complete 3 hours of neuropsychological testing, which is an awful lot of testing. And he was exhausted. So we thought, well, this is great. He's really, really tired. And so we took him down to our brain scanner, because we do a lot of brain imaging on children. We use a magnetic scanner. We use a magnetic scanner because it involves no radiation and it's safe and you can do it repeatedly. It's a perfectly safe thing to do. So little Peter, he went into this magnetic scanner, this big MRI machine, and we set it up so he can watch a movie. So he sits and watches his favourite movie. And after about 10 minutes, he manages to complete an absolutely perfect scan. Absolutely perfect. And at the end of it, his mother turned to me and offered to buy the $5.4 million scanner. So there you go. So this is very typical, a little Peter, little sweetheart, really nice kid, but having a really tough time. He was already been asked to leave one preschool because they just can't handle him. They felt he was impacting so negatively on the learning experience of other children. Really isolated from a lot of his peers, because the child's experience of this kid is that he's constantly in their space. He's just impulsive and has a poor sense of boundary control, but that's not other children's experience of him. They see him as a bit overbearing and a bit of a bully, and he's not really, but he's isolated from his peers. And then also his parents, the parents are very, very clear. They love this child to bits, but they're not always clear that they like him very much. They just try pulling their hair out. So this is a kid who really should be doing very well. On his IQ testing, his IQ was really quite high. He was really struggling even to learn how to read. His attention was so bad. So this is a kid who's really not doing well at all. He should be doing above average. He's not. He's doing way, 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 way below average. And that's because he has profound problems with inattention. He's extremely hyperactive. He's extremely impulsive. These problems are really getting in the way of this kid's development. So appropriately, he is diagnosed as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's the mix of, first and foremost, the kid has problems, and this impairment extends to school, home, and with friends often. And the impairment largely comes from problems with attention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. That's what ADHD is. Now, there's another little kid in our study, Susan, little girl, little 6-year-old girl as well, extremely hyper, very physically impulsive. This is a kid who, dashing out of the room, dashing all over the place. We got her to do a computerized task, and within minutes she was under the desk doing it like this without looking. It was a disaster. So really extraordinarily distractible, one of the most distractible kids I've ever met. Just everything caught her attention. Just constantly, completely unable to stay focused. If you can't stay focused, it's very, very difficult to learn. And that's exactly what was happening with her as well. She was really, really struggling at school, and again had lots of problems relating to other little girls in particular. She tended to hang out with little boys who were a little bit older than her, and also had problems regulating her emotions. She had a lot of meltdowns, which is a very common feature we see in kids with ADHD. Impulsivity doesn't just refer to impulsivity of action, it's also in a way impulsivity of emotions and your ability to control them. So again, this is a kid who's really struggling. She's struggling at school, she's struggling with her peers, she's having problems at home, and it's because of these triad of problems with attention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. So she has ADHD as well. This is exactly the sort of kids we see in our study. Now, needless to say, Peter and Susan are not alone. ADHD is probably the most common childhood problem that's diagnosed in the States at the minute. This is actually from 2007. This is from the CDC's national survey. They phone up everyone and said, has your child been diagnosed with ADHD? This is where our sort of guess rate that we teach people of about 6 to 7% of kids, 1 in 20 kids in the States will be diagnosed with ADHD at some stage in their life. The rate's probably climbing up a little bit, although I think it's going to stabilise. So it's hovering around there. So it's a very, very, very prevalent problem in America, as it is throughout the rest of the world. There is no nation that has no ADHD, none. The rates do vary. What doesn't vary is the presentation of children. These behaviours are seen in all cultures, in all contexts. What that culture chooses to call it varies a lot, but you see these problems everywhere. You can go anywhere and you can sort of say to someone, in societies that do not have traditional schooling structures, you can say, who are the kids who are causing problems? And I can guarantee they will point to the hyperactive, impulsive little kid. And these forms of behaviour are ubiquitous. They're across culture and across time. So what can the brain tell us about ADHD? Well, I'm going to start off, this isn't a hard sell, so what I'm going to start off with are some take-home things, some grounding points to remember about all of this. So I will say, and it really is, like neuroimaging is so exciting, it really is unbelievably great. It's only been the past 20 years that we've really been able to safely look at the developing brain. And this is a huge advance by anyone's standards. But it's only 20 years old. It is still a science that is growing a lot. But already in that time, I think it has told us a great deal. Some of the highlights of that I'll sort of try to convey to you. But it's got a long way to go. And the biggest challenges at the minute is to remember that these brain scans will not diagnose ADHD. They just haven't got there yet. What they're great at, and what I will show, is that they can pretty consistently, if you have 100 kids with ADHD and 100 kids who don't have ADHD, who have no developmental issues at all, there will be very subtle differences. This isn't at the stage where you can pick an individual child, look at the brain scan and say, ta-da, there's ADHD. It's not there yet. I think it's getting there, and I really think it will start to be clinically useful at some stage, but it's not there yet. The diagnosis of ADHD is still clinical, and that's meant it's done through the interview from the physician or the psychologist with the parent, with the teachers, and with the child, and that is still how we make the diagnosis of ADHD. Imaging, I think at some stage will inform, as will genetics, but we're not there yet. I think that's the grounding point for today. There you go. There's really very few, what did I do there? Here we go. I'll go back. There we go. So there's really very few reasons ever to do an MRI if a child presents, if you're suspecting something like a form of epilepsy, but very, 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 very few reasons to do an MRI. As I said, hopefully in 10, maybe 20 years, we won't be saying the same thing. I really think at that stage it will start to kick in and maybe be translated into the clinic, but that's where we are at the minute. All of those riders aside, I'll just go on and give you a whistle-stop tour of brain imaging. Now, there are lots of different ways of looking at the brain. This is using the magnetic resonance imaging scanner, which is the one that doesn't involve radiation, so it's safe. So here, you can look at brain structure. So you can look at brain structure or brain function. Here we're looking at brain structure. And this is one of the MRI. This is a typical slice of an MRI. And what it can do then, it's really cool. So it goes into the MRIs, and you get these from all different levels of the head. And from that, the computer will go in and you use these fancy softwares to extract different structures. So it can get you different volumes, the volumes of how big the frontal lobes are, the volumes of how big deep structures in the brain are. So that's volumetric data, which is actually still really very useful. You can also go on and extract the cortex. So the cortex is like the mantle that covers the brain. It's the thinking, the grey matter of the brain. And it's like a folded sheet. And if you imagine, that's our sort of, our curly cortex that goes all round. So you can actually extract that using these softwares. And what it can do is measure properties of this cortical sheet or the cortical mantle. It can measure all sorts of things like how thick it is, how big the surface area is, how folded it is. And all of these measures are extraordinarily informative. So this is just brain structure. And of course, we can also look at brain function. And we can use MRI to look at brain function as well. It's not something I'm going to talk about too much tonight unless someone's interested. But there basically what you're looking at is if you're using a part of the brain, you burn off oxygen in that part of the brain, so it gives off a slightly different signal when you're in the brain scanner. It's a very clever way of using magnetic resonance imaging. So structure and function. I'm mainly going to talk about brain structure, although like everyone we do a bit of functional stuff too. So where are we with it all? And we're at the stage now in the imaging of ADHD where there have been literally, I'd say about 50 good large studies looking at a large number of children who have ADHD and a large number of children who are matched on lots of other things like age, sex, socioeconomic status, and comparing them. And there's so many now, you can add them all up. If one study finds something, that's great. If 50 studies find it, it's much better. And we're at the stage where we're now doing things like what findings do we keep getting across different studies. And this is a particularly nice one. So notice the year. This was in 2011. This is a brain slice. So if you imagine if you got me and you chopped my brain down the middle there, so it's from the front. So you're looking at the brain at the front. Imagine the eyes are at the front here and the back of the head's there. So here, this is just a slice down the brain. And you can see all sorts of things. This grey thing, that's the cortex. This is white matter, which joins the different parts of the brain together. And you see these deep things here. These are called the striatum. They're like the information processing centers of the brain. And how the brain is organized, roughly speaking, is there are loops that go from here to the cortex and back, here to the cortex and back. And that's information processing. Now, what's fascinating is this study, already in 2011, that's quite a while back, it added up all of the structures of the kids with ADHD and said, where is the parts of the brain very slightly smaller in the kids with ADHD? So this isn't one study, this is adding about 12 studies with several hundred children. And it found these regions in blue here were very slightly smaller in kids with ADHD as a group. Again, one child, you wouldn't be able to pick it up and say, oh, look, it's smaller, therefore they have ADHD. But at a group level, these regions were smaller, and they're the deep information processing centers of the brain, which makes an awful lot of sense whenever you see some of the psychological challenges that kids with ADHD often have. So these deep structures, they're called the striatum, and as a group, they were a little bit smaller in kids with ADHD. Again, this does not mean every kid with ADHD has a smaller one at all. There's a huge overlap with typically developing kids who have no problems at all. But at a group level, there is a difference, and it was in this region. And this was 2011. And I don't know if any of you watch the news, but ADHD was in the news recently. There was a big splash It was incredible. And it was a paper I was on. I thought, good Lord, why are they interested in that? It wasn't my aim. I was one of the many, many people. So this is one of these lovely studies where scientists all across the world, because people who participate in our studies very kindly consent to this. So it's from all over the world. There were 23 sites. I think 5 of them were in the States, the rest were abroad, all got together and looked at all of the imaging data they had on kids with ADHD and kids who didn't have ADHD. And I said, if we pile this all together, what are our results? And here are the results. So this is a huge study. So that was this year in the Lancet Psychiatry. So it has 1,700 kids with ADHD and 1,500 kids who don't have ADHD. This is kids and adults. And this is a complex slide, but basically what it's showing is you see the way the lines are going down. 0 is where a kid who's never had any problems with attention would be. That's sort of like your baseline. If it goes down, it means that brain structure is a little bit smaller in this big group with ADHD. And you can see it was a little bit. But, and these are all the deep structures of the brain I was talking about, the deep information processing centers of the brain. But there's several things to notice about this. This measure here, a 0.1 difference, is very, very, very significant at a group level, but it's almost meaningless for an individual. It's a tiny shift. So it means if you get, all of us have different sized brains, and you can imagine it follows a nice little curve like that. In ADHD, all as this is saying is it's the same sort of curve, it's just shifted a tiny bit. Just a tiny fraction. So as you can imagine, there's still enormous overlap there, even though the curves are very slightly shifted. And that was the upshot of this. That it's still remarkably important study. This is remarkable. This is just showing across many, many different nations, across many different sites and studies and scanners and diagnostic tradition, we are still finding a consistent difference, which is subtle, in the brains of kids that have ADHD, speaking to that there is a neurobiological component here. It's not all there is to it, but it's there. And this is the sort of study that really clinches it. If you get 1,000, you're not going to get a study bigger than that. So that's the sort of the very recent paper that came out and caused a lot of interest, just clinching, I think, that across sites we detect very subtle changes, and they're subtle. So this is really exciting, but all of these studies are what you call cross-sectional. They're like snapshots of the brain. So they get, say, a kid who's 8 years old in and compares them to another 8-year-old kid, and they're snapshot studies, and they're very good. But obviously, as anyone who works with children knows, kids aren't snapshots. They're an unfolding movie. They change with time, they're dynamic, they will alter so much. A kid at 8 will look very different whenever they're 10 and 12 years old. So this is the approach that we've been taking, along with many others, saying that ADHD, part of the story is dynamic, part of the story is developmental. It is a developmental problem. Let's take a developmental approach to studying it. And what that means is the very, very many great families who participate in our studies don't come once, they come back year after year after year. And that allows us to look at the kids and the families as they grow up. So instead of studying change by looking at different individuals by different times, we have the power, thanks to the families, of studying the same kid as they grow up. And it's a very powerful design. It's the way to study development. Look at how one kid changes over time. And so we've got about 500 kids now in this study who are participating and who with their families are coming repeatedly, giving us this very, very powerful, great data. So that's why we use it, because if you're studying a moving target, you want a movie, you don't want a snapshot. So that's why we do this sort of work. So what sort of stuff do we look at? So this is a structural study. We've done it with function as well, but I'll talk about structure. So this is a method. So the software goes in and it extracts from that picture this, and this is the deep information processing center of the brain. It's called the striatum. And here you're going to see you have 2 of them, one on the right, one on the left. And this is from the front, and then we're going to spin it around a bit more, and this is from the side. If you can imagine, these sit deep in the center of the brain, these little structures. And these little images here are actually recreated from every single child in the study. So for every single child in this study, we get the computer, it goes in and it extracts this surface, these deep information processing things. And what's lovely about this study is because we have it repeatedly on kids, we can look at how these change with time. So what all did we do? Well, the first thing we did was we did the very classic snapshots thing. You know, whenever the kid first came into the study, there were 270 kids in this study, who had ADHD, 270 kids who never had any issues like that at all. And we compared them. And these are different views of those deep structures in the brain. So don't worry what they are. That's just deep things in the brain. We all have them. And if you see a bright colour, especially bright red, it means that part is just very slightly smaller in the kids with ADHD. Again, this is a small difference, but it's significant because it's a big group. And you see that, and that's not very surprising. I showed you stuff earlier saying maybe things are shifted a little bit, so you would expect this. But this is the sort of baseline contrast. But now we can ask, if you look at these structures in these kids as they grow up over time, is there anything that is developing differently in these deep information processing centers of the brain? So here, we're no longer snapshot, we're looking at the movie of these deep structures as they develop. And so here, this is a complex slide, but just look at this little figure here. So this is one little part of these deep information processing structures. This is how that tiny little area changes over development, this graph, and then each one refers to a different point. But just look at this one. So here we have age, and here we have how big that little area is. It divides the structure up into tiny little hexagons and measures its area. So blue, you have typically developing kids who never had any problems with attention, and you can see that tiny little area of the brain grows with age. And this is on 270 kids as they're growing up. So it just gets a little bit bigger. So look now at the kids with ADHD, it's a tiny bit smaller and it stays a wee bit smaller. And that was, you know, the pattern for a lot of regions in it. You've got other regions like this where the difference really isn't very much at all, and you wouldn't expect that. All those regions in the white, there's no difference at all, okay? But that was sort of, you know, basically in ADHD, it seemed that they were pretty similar. But then we said, is there anywhere where they were very dissimilar, where growth was completely different between the two groups? And there was. And this is in this part of the brain. Now, here what we're doing is those deep structures of the brain, we're just flipping them upside down. So you're looking at them from below. And so do you see in those green regions there, these are parts of those deep structures that did grow differently in the groups. So this is your typical kids, this is age, this is how big that region is. It gets bigger with age, which is pretty much what all of that structure did. It just got bigger with age. But look at the kids with ADHD, and this was the only place where there really was a marked difference. And you can see, instead of getting bigger, it actually didn't change much at all. It got a little bit smaller, not hugely, but a little bit. There's still a lot of overlap, but a little bit. And that was a big diagnostic difference. And the point of this is not that that's a particular, not that bad a difference at all, to be honest. Look how big, like if it's 245 here, it's 255 there. These are subtle differences, but they're there. But the point of this is that if you just looked at age 9, when most of the kids came in, you would say that region didn't differ at all. If you look at the child as they grow up, you begin to see differences. It shows the importance of looking at a developmental disorder, taking a developmental approach, looking at how something is growing rather than just how it starts. You know, the journey of getting there is every bit as important as where you start and where you end. And that's kind of all this slide is showing, and why we do so much time seeing the same kids time after time as they grow up. So that's just saying it, you know, why do we do this? Why do we do it? And I think it's because sometimes the differences you detect, you wouldn't get from a snapshot. And also, it might tell us something about the biology. And actually, that underbelly, that bit of the brain is very interesting. It's called the ventral striatum, and it's involved in the processing of rewards. And many children with ADHD have a preference for small immediate rewards over large delayed rewards. So for example, you say to a kid, well, do you want $1 now or $5 in an hour? And I can bet you a kid with ADHD will have the $1 now. You know, is that sort of, and this reward processing center of the brain might have something to do with it. Again, this is neither The only impact of this is it might make you think about ways of altering behavioural structures for these kids, for example. That's the sort of impact of this stuff. I'll go back and I'll talk about Peter and Susan. So Peter, as you remember, he came into our study, the little 6-year-old, got his head stuck. So he came back, and Peter, whenever he was diagnosed, was started on a psychostimulant medication, which is still, on the whole, by far the most effective medication for ADHD, which has got a very favourable side effect profile. It has side effects, needs to be monitored, but we know from many, many studies it's effective. And he responded extremely well to Ritalin, one of the psychostimulants. And he also had good behavioural management at school. He had a good 504 plan, briefly an IEP, then back to a 504. But basically the school was very responsive to differences in how he learned. And he did really very well. So at middle school, his parents noticed that occasionally they'd forget to give him his medication. It didn't make that much difference. So after a while they thought, well, we'll just stop it. And they did. Anyway, he was fine. He was fine. His sort of ADHD had begun to melt away. And whenever we last saw him at age 15, he really was pretty much fine. He had 1 or 2 symptoms of ADHD, nothing much, maybe a little bit inattentive, no hyperactivity at all. His impulsivity had gone, he had just sort of melted away and was, doing really, really very well. And he was planning to go to college. In fact, he's now in college. So this is a kid who had, no doubt about it, rip-roaring ADHD when he was a kid and is now remitted. Think now of Susan. So Susan at baseline looked very similar to Peter. So she was diagnosed with ADHD. Didn't do so well with any of the treatment options that we have. She just didn't respond as well. She just, lots of side effects, not much benefit. She was one of the minority of kids who doesn't do well on medication. She also didn't really get much access to behavioural interventions anywhere, so she didn't get a chance to benefit from that either. But, so she struggled. Now, this is a girl whose IQ is 115, which is, it's really high. She's someone who should be doing really well, headed to college, but barely graduated high school just because of this pervasive impulsivity and inattention. A major factor for her throughout her teens was the inability to sustain peer relationships, a real problem with her. And at age 16, whenever we saw her last, she still had a marked amount of symptoms. She still was hyperactive. It's different whenever you're an adult. She was impulsive, extremely impulsive still, and markedly inattentive. So this is someone whose ADHD has really not shifted at all. It really hasn't moved. It's persisting. So this raises the question, why did Peter do so much better than Susan? Well, the first question is, how typical are those two outcomes of ADHD in general? And we now know that a fair amount, and this again is a complicated slide, but basically what's been done now is there have been enough studies that have taken lots of kids and followed them as they grow up. ADHD as a diagnosis has been around for 20, 30 years now, so lots of people have followed kids up into their 20s, 30s and 40s. So we know the natural, what happens on a group level as ADHD grows up. And this is kind of a summary of lots of papers. So this is age. This is what age the kids are at follow-up. And this is the percentage of kids who had ADHD at baseline. How many still have ADHD? So look first at the green line. Now the green line are the kids who have ADHD, which is very, very severe. It started off very severe and it remained very severe. It was completely full-on ADHD. And ADHD, when you define it like that as the full syndrome, definitely decreases with age, particularly the hyperactivity and the impulsivity. What often lingers is the inattention. And if you insist on very strict diagnostic criteria, it's about 1 in 5 kids will still have the full-blown unchanged ADHD in their 20s, roughly speaking. The red line are kids who no longer, you would say, well, they don't have full-blown ADHD, but they actually have lots of problems, and it's nearly always problems due to lingering inattention. And that's 2/3 of the kids. And that leaves about 1/3 who are kind of like Peter and really don't have many problems at all. So roughly speaking, you've then got from these longitudinal, these big long studies following lots of kids up into adulthood now, maybe about 1 in 5 will still have, at some form, ADHD. About 1 in 3, I would say, a very good remission, and the remainder will be somewhere in between. Often you find it's inattention that lingers much more than hyperactivity and impulsivity. Okay? So that's kind of the science of, what happens to ADHD. And I will point out, this is the value of longitudinal work. When I was at medical school, which wasn't that long ago, we were taught that the persistence rate of ADHD was 1 in 1,000. That it was completely a problem of childhood, and everyone, 1 in 1,000. And that was, just completely incorrect. But that's what, was in the textbooks way back in the day. And so we now know, the picture is much more complicated than that. It does persist in the full syndrome a lot, and a lot of other people have symptoms.
Why did the curves start in different places?
Yeah, that's because of the studies they're summarizing. So there are different studies. There's 10 studies that are added up to make those curves. So if you see each different one, it would start at a different place. So that's why. I kind of think the later you start, the more, if you start at 100, you've got less time to go down. I think that would be the main impact of that. I'll tell you what probably does have the most impact is how severe the ADHD was at the start. But yeah, good question. Cool. And do feel free to interrupt. So I'm really interested that why do kids do so differently as they grow up? So whenever I came to NIH, one of the lovely things about working intramurally, the big campus up in Bethesda, is it has some stability. And so we are allowed, it's good. So we brought back, so there were Judy Rappaport and Jay Geed and Javier Castellanos, these really great people who worked, some of them still do, at NIMH Mental Health in the 1990s, where they did really pioneering studies in ADHD, even back whenever people would argue about it. So what I decided to do was, well, they had all of these kids in the 1990s, let's bring them back whenever in 2010 and see how they're doing. So we did. So this study, there were 202 kids in the 1990s who were assessed at NIH at the mean age of about 10, and there were 350 kids who had no problems. So we managed to track down, actually I didn't track them down, we had this absolutely fantastic research assistant called Megan. Honestly, if you ever want anyone found, call Megan. It's just she was a holy terror. Anyway, so we got back at the age of, and this is 14 years later, about 50%, and we had good phone contact with the remainder. This is a population all over the geographically, and we could only bring back the ones locally, so this is a pretty good return rate. And we got back 210 of those who were unaffected. And what we did, and one of the lovely things is the scanner, the reason we had a hurry on to do it is because the scanner that we used was about to be decommissioned. So we've been using it for years, and if you change scanners mid-study, it's a disaster. So we rushed back and we got Megan on it, and Megan dragging everyone around. So anyway, and we managed to scan all these individuals very kindly who came to NIH. So we've got clinical assessments on them when they are 10 and when they are 24, and we have brain images acquired on the same scanner at age 10 and 24, which is just as good as it gets. It really is great. So there you go. So what happened clinically to these kids? So they, 37 of them still had persistent ADHD. That's a little bit higher than the other studies, but I think that reflects how severe these kids were when they entered the study. They really were, very impaired with their ADHD. 55 had remitted, would no longer meet criteria for ADHD, and they never have found. So these are the ones who had good brain images. So what did we find? Well, the reason for doing this is it allows you to ask questions. If you ask 100 people, how do you think someone gets better from ADHD, gets over ADHD, remits from ADHD? Most people will say, well, they compensate. They compensate, and therefore that implies that the brain is somehow reorganizing itself. There are novel strategies coming online. Now, there's a much older school of thinking, this is way back in the 50s, that said, no, actually, ADHD is probably, the large part of it, is the best example we have of a truly developmental problem, which comes and it goes. And when it goes, the brain will look pretty typical. So it's a very different way of thinking it. One of it is reorganization, compensation reorganization, and the other one is just convergence to more typical structure and function. So that's what we were looking at here. Which one is right? Or which one is the evidence in favor for? Because the picture is going to be complicated. So this is just, at this level, which one is it? So what we did then,
What's the never affected controls?
Those are individuals who never had any problems with it. So if you look at those numbers, so we had children here, adult clinical assessment here, and then the last slide shows the number who had good quality brain imaging. And that's the drop-off. Some people didn't have brain images that we could use because, sometimes people wiggle in the scanner or they don't like it. So that's the drop-off, is the drop-off. Cool. But in this study, what we're doing then is we have the clinical data when you're 10 and when you're 24, and we have your brain when you're 10 and you're 24. And we're saying as you have these different clinical courses of persistence or remission, what's happening in the brain? And so what we studied here was the cerebral cortex, the folded, the sheet. And what we looked at here was the thickness of the cortex, and you use a very sophisticated software to measure how thick the cortex is at 50,000 points across the cortex. So that's what we did. So we have all these individuals and we have their cortex at age 10 and then at 24 and so on. Okay? And then from that you can say where in the brain was the change in the cortex? Where did it reflect your adult outcome? It's not going to be the whole brain. Are there bits in the brain that are really sensitive to how you're going to do? And they were these regions. So this is complicated. So this is the brain looking from above and from the side, and this is the brain split down the middle. So this is one brain. This is just opening it up like that, and this is looking at it from each side. Anywhere where you see the color means that in those regions, the way the cortex developed was reflected the ultimate adult outcome of ADHD. So in those regions develop differently according to how your ADHD was doing. Okay? So that means that those who are remitting and those who are persisting will show different growth only in those regions. In the rest of the brain, there was no difference at all. But in those regions, there were subtle differences. And this is what the differences looked like. So here we go. So this is age. And this is the thickness. Remember I said we're looking at the thickness of the cortex. And look first at the blue line, who are individuals who never had any problems with ADHD at all. And the cortex gets thinner during adolescence. And we know that. The cortex starts off, gets a wee bit bigger, gets thinner all throughout adolescence, and then it sort of tapers off into the age of 20, and then it takes another nosedive at some ungodly age. But anyway, there you go. So that's how the cortex, everyone knows it. The cortex, this is what happens to the cortex during adolescence, and that's a good thing. It's pruning and stuff like that. So this is typical. So these are kids who started off with ADHD, tiny bit thinner, really a tiny bit thinner. But you can see with age, as they get better, they are converging towards where the never affected were. It's convergence. And look now at the group in red. So these are the individuals who had persistent ADHD. They started off a wee bit thinner, and they remained a little bit thinner. So they sort of had a fixed, there was no real change. It started off a bit and then remained there as well. So this, I think, would be kind of in favour of this idea of actually catch up. If you're remitting from ADHD, maybe it's just a process of converging towards something that looks very similar to the brain of the never affected. And actually, we didn't just find this for white matter structure, we looked at all sorts of other things as well. So we looked at something called white matter. So white matter are the wires in the brain that join different brain regions together. So whenever I'm speaking, this part of the brain is firing, this part of the brain is firing, this part of the brain is firing, and information is being sent to all different parts of the brain through white matter tracts. And that's what this is measuring, the white matter microstructure. And actually we find that in individuals with ADHD that had completely gotten better by adulthood, you couldn't really tell any difference between their white matter microstructure and the white matter of individuals who were never affected by ADHD. And that also held for, that also held for a lot of brain functional tasks that we tried. So we looked at the brains in lots of different ways. It was kind of saying the same story. Now, believe me, there are subtleties to all of this, and this is just the predominant theme. And there are definitely parts of the brain that are reorganizing. There have to be. And this is only as good as our current technology can look at it. So I'm sure if we looked at it in another way, we might find a different story. But looking at it the ways that we currently can, it was sort of compatible with this idea of if you're remitting from ADHD, you're converging towards more typical brain structure and function, much more than your brain is reorganizing itself. And that's very important because it's not just theoretically interesting. It says an awful lot of stuff about how are we going to get brain imaging from NIH, these fantastic research studies, into the clinic. And it actually has a big importance. You have to know what you're looking for. as a marker for recovery before you make it clinically useful. We have to understand the neurobiology of getting better and still having problems before we can take it into the clinic and have markers for it. So this might sound very academic, but it's the first step towards getting something that could be clinically useful. We can't have markers really without understanding something about biology, or it's unlikely the markers would work. So basically, in the brain structure one, what happened is, and remember, again I'm stressing, this is all group level stuff. The amount of individual variation here is enormous. So none of this is ready for the clinic, so please, I don't want to overstate this at all. But at a group level, absolutely. What that looked like is, if you're remitting, as you're remitting, you converge towards more typical dimensions. Yeah. Now, and the question was, what would reorganization look like? And what would compensation look like in the brain? And to be honest, compensation and reorganization, I think, is better detected through the other ways we looked at the brain function. So what we did in these adults is we made them do a task that demands an awful lot of attention processing capability. It's a really boring task. It's a really boring task. So we make an individual do it, and what you find is, so imagine if the brain is reorganizing, in those who are getting better, you would expect they would do fine in this task, and they did brilliantly, but you would expect that the brain function would still look different from those who were never affected. They'd be using different parts of the brain, for example. We didn't find that at all. Exactly. So compensation, and the way I'm sort of using, I think, is better detected by brain function. It's more dynamic, you know. So that's actually how we looked at that. But it's a great question. Harder was structure to detect. Harder. Yeah, thank you. So just to give you a wee overview, how am I doing for time? Okay. So just to give you some idea of, the state of the field is neuroimaging, still a young science, but already we are finding subtle signatures of ADHD that are being repeated across different sites. And, it's not ready for clinic time yet, but it's the first stage, to get these effects that everyone can agree are sort of there. By taking a dynamic approach, you sort of look at when might things be happening. So the where is, where in the brain might ADHD have a particular impact. When is best defined by taking this longitudinal view, so you can define windows of development that might be particularly important. And then, of course, the next question is what? What's driving all of this? What are the factors, the genetic factors, the environmental factors that are causing these differences that we see in ADHD? And that's actually the bulk of the work we're doing at the minute, but not much of it I'm going to talk about. So, what I thought I'd talk about instead, it's actually something that people find, and I found really interesting, was the social context of ADHD. And little kids with ADHD and the relationships that they form with peers. And now the reason that we looked at peer relationship is because, quite rightly, most research into the social context of kids with ADHD has focused on their family. There is a lot of research on families in which the kid, and often a parent, has ADHD as well. A lot of research on that. But actually, we were quite influenced by a lot of the work showing that the amount of time a child spends with their family is actually probably a little bit less than they spend with their peers. And healthy peer relationships are actually pretty pivotal to an optimal development for a child. They really have quite the impact, peer relationships. And it's been pretty much understudied in ADHD. I think just the demands of the family, quite rightly, was the first protocol. So we decided to look at peer context instead, informed more by the developmental psychology literature, just highlighting the importance of good peer relationships for optimal development for kids. And so the global aim of this is to sort of, we do know from, if you do a survey with parents and you say, can you tell us what are the top 5 problems for your kid? Invariably, relationships with peers comes up in there. And it ranks almost as highly as problems with attention. So, people are very aware often of relationships with peers. This does not mean that many kids with ADHD can be extraordinarily successful with their peers, but as a group, again, it can be a challenge for some of these kids, mainly whenever the child is very impulsive. So this was the aim of it. We know it's a bit of a problem. We know the peer context is important, so let's try to understand what's happening. So this was a really interesting study that we actually did in collaboration with some Dutch colleagues in Rotterdam. And we did it there because they have these lovely population cohorts. And we wanted to do this in a population setting rather than a clinic setting. Because, you can't study peer relationships in a clinic. You've got to go into the schools to study it. So this is what they did in Generation R, and we did with them. So there's 1,300 kids. And basically, at ages 1.5, 3, and 5.5, they got all the kids in to the Erasmus Hospital, and they asked the parents, how are your kids doing? And they did these standardized questionnaires which asked about childhood symptoms of ADHD and related problems, and childhood mood and anxiety problems. And so they asked them at age 1.5, 3, and 5. And from that, you could get kids' problems. And you get all these different little groups of kids. You get some kids who really struggle the entire time, particularly with ADHD. You get some kids who start off quite low and then have more problems as they grow up. You have some other kids who do exactly the opposite. And you have a lot of kids who have, never anything really much to talk about at all. So you get these very different groups of developmental trajectories of mental health. So what we were really interested in is there is a thinking that if a kid has a problem, they're just going to have a problem globally. If a kid has a problem with their mental health, they're probably just going to struggle with their peers, full stop. And we were wondering, is the link much more specific than that? Our little kids whose problems are mainly of the ADHD variety, does that have a different impact later in life than the kids who have mainly mood and anxiety problems? So here we're looking at what is the impact of these early life trajectories on this, your friendships within the classroom. So what we're doing is we're linking this history with this. And to measure, how did we measure this? Well, this is what the Dutch did, it's great. So they go into the classroom and a little kid is sat in front of a laptop, and these are all of the other kids in the classroom. And then they say to them, okay, in Dutch, you're going to the zoo. Who are the 5 people you would like to go with you? And so the little kid taps on the 5 sort of, people they would do. And all the kids do this on each other. So everyone is informing on each other. So you get this very complex web or a network, a pro-social network, a friendship network. And then, as they're Dutch, they're very brutal. They say, you're going to the zoo, who won't you bring along? I know. As soon as I saw that, I said, oh no, that's me. Oh no, it's terrible. Anyway, very upsetting. So anywho, so you do that, and this is the rejection network. This is the network of, who in school wouldn't get asked to go to things.
Just one? They choose just
They can choose up to 5. Oh, yeah, after that's for mathematics. And then they do one, and then they do, so someone falls and hurts their knee, who would be the first 5 people to help? And then they do a bullying one, actually. And then a victim one, who bullies and who victims. So we have, from this data, you get these very complex webs of friendship, of rejection, of helping, of bullying, and of being victimized. So there's these very complex, and you can measure the properties of these. And so I'll show you the sort of things you get. So there's actually 30 each child is a little dot, each line. So this is a rejection network. This little dot here is a kid actually who had very severe ADHD problems at age 1, 3, and 5. And this little kid, you can see, is rejected by a lot of other people in the classroom. And this little kid is also rejecting to other kids, is actively sort of saying no as well. So this little kid is what you call central to this network. And unfortunately, it's not an optimal network. It's never fun to be central to a rejection network. And that was, what a lot of these little kids... Yeah, as our current politics show us. Anyway, and these are little kids who have mood and anxiety problems. This is just a snippet. This is a snippet of one classroom. This is the little kid here. And you see the rejection network. No one's rejecting this little kid, and this little kid is rejecting one other. They're pretty isolated. In a rejection network, they're pretty isolated, okay? And you can actually measure these, and you can give them quantities, and you can do all sorts of fancy network statistics, a lot of which are derived from how we all interact in the web. But anyway, and so from that, you can quantify the difference in this. And you get this very fancy metric. But basically, what we find is consistently, the little kids with ADHD really had a disadvantageous position in rejection networks in particular. They really did. Didn't do so bad in some of the other networks, actually. And the little kids with mood and anxiety actually didn't do badly at all, except for the pro-social network where they didn't do too well. But anyway, but basically the point of this is that the childhood history you had actually had quite a significant impact on where you ended up with your peers, and it was quite different for different histories. It's not that you had a problem and you ended up having more. Children are very responsive to other children. And the other thing we did with this, which I won't talk too much about, is we actually also had genotyping on all of these kids as well. We had their genetics. So we genotyped these children, and from that you can estimate how much are genes likely to play a role in this, as opposed to the environment. And actually genes played quite a big role, which people always freak out, but that doesn't really matter, because genetic disorders or genetic issues are indeed amongst those that are most sensitive towards the environment. So it's not because something's genetic doesn't mean you can't change it at all. But anyway, so we did that as well. But the point of all of this is really that these little positions in social networks, you can just imagine the power of leveraging those. If we understand how little kids would probably interact, instead of our classic way of working with kids with ADHD, for example, is to take the child out of the classroom, put them in a behavioral setting, often with one psychologist, who's very, very skilled, or often with me, and I'm semi-skilled. And then, and then you take the child and you work with the families, but then they go back to the classroom where, who knows what's going to happen. Imagine other ways in which we can not only have to problematize a child, but can do something that's advantageous for the entire network, rather than singling out a child. It's a very sort of optimistic way of looking at leveraging education and leveraging peer network theory to boost the outcome of all children. This has been done very successfully, actually, I'll note, with some drug prevention strategies in teenagers, leveraging popular kids as ways into sort of doing education messages, this peer education model. And this is, ramping it up to make it even a little more, so getting the different sorts of networks. So that's the idea behind all of this, is if you map the networks, you might get good points for intervention. Mm-hmm. Oh, so they just have there are 30 kids, classmates in front of them, and say, who would you not want to take? You can choose up to 5.
They have to.
Exactly. You had to pick at least one.
Okay.
But you could pick no more than 5, because you might get someone who's a little naughty, a little oppositional, going, no, don't like anyone. That's not going to be very informative. So, there's a limit, and you do this from the curves. And so that's why. So there you go, cool. So, and I'm perfect timing. So just saying, that's the reason we do it, is that, it might be a very good point of intervention. And a lot of our science is actually using the brain as a target. I do mainly genetics now. And in all of this work, when we're looking at the genetics of something, we actually don't really too much use the diagnosis of ADHD for genetics. We use the brain. We use the different measures in the brain because they're easier to measure, they're more quantifiable. So we use those. And if you imagine it, genes code for the brain, and it's the brain that produces ADHD. So genes are closer. The brain is closer to genes than the symptoms of ADHD. Does that make sense? So so you're getting really into that. So we do an awful lot of work looking at brain, really reducing things to the brain. And this is saying, well, actually look above the child as well. There might be things happening in the wider context that might be helpful as well. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. No, that's very good. So the question is about, the role of genes and the relative balance and the different stages of life. So the traditional way of parsing out how much is something genetic and how much is something environmental is to use twins. So you look at identical twins and non-identical twins. The idea being that the identical twin is identical and the non-identical twin shares 50% of the, but they live in the same environment. So that's the assumption behind the model, which if you do it that way, which is a very traditional way of looking at genes and environment, ADHD emerges about as heritable as height. It's really very, very heritable. There's a lot of genetic stuff there. And of the environmental cause, which is about 60-70%. Of the environmental stuff, most of it is what you call unique environment. So it's not things you share with your siblings, it's something that's unique to you. So that could be the environment in utero. Absolutely. So again, there are lots of problems with that because genes unfold in an environment. The environment turns on and off genes. It's the interplay that we should be looking at, not taking them apart. And you raised that very good example of how you might think something is an environment whenever actually it's genetic. So you give the example of in utero exposure. Say, I'll tell you what, I'll give you another one. So say we have something is attributed to So we go in and we do a study, and we find that in families with ADHD, there is amongst the parenting style, but say it's too rewarding. It's rewarding immediately all the time, okay? And someone says, well, that's environmental. That's the child's environmental exposure, blah, 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 blah. But actually, if you think about it, wow, ADHD is highly heritable. This parent could have ADHD, and therefore this is genetics that's just coming down. And we know giving out an immediately rewarding environment is actually suitable to ADHD. So it's a very subtle example of how what we think is genetic is sometimes environmental and vice versa. The point of all of that is not to confuse you, but just to say we need to think of the interplay more, which I think is the point you were getting at. It's hard to drag the two apart, although we have to some extent. We have to know where to put our, go first. If something is incredibly heritable, like ADHD, genes are going to play a role. There's just no two ways about it. They are going to be really important, and we have to come to grips with them. And you need to know that, because there are many problems that aren't terribly heritable. So genes are less likely to play a role. And it's good to know, because that way you can sort of think, well, what should we go for first as we tick things off? But as soon as you get anywhere into it, you begin to see the interplay is remarkably complex. And sometimes things we think are genetic are environmental. Does that help? Is that sort of, yeah, sort of? It'll do. It'll do. It's complicated. It's complicated. It's complicated, but in some ways not that complicated, because we know so much about ADHD. Like, it is remarkable whenever you tell people 60-70% of it is probably heritable. People are like, what? That's crazy. And you're like, yeah, no, it really is, because goodness, God. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that's so genes are going to be in there in the mix. It's not going to be one gene. It's going to be a very complex set of genes that do complex things. But it tells you you've got to look at genes anyway. That's partly why I moved institute. I looked at it and said, goodness, you've got to look at genes, and so go somewhere that looks at genes, not just NIH. Yeah. Ooh, that's a very good question. So the question is, why is ADHD so prevalent amongst kids who are adopted? It's a really, really good question. So I think there are 2 or 3 possible answers to that. I suppose if you look at the age of adoption studies from Romania, what you find is that children who were late adopted and had very early rearing experience, so this would be environmental, that was very impoverished, had very high rates of ADHD. Particularly I think it was something like after 18 months, it was really shot up. Before that, actually, it didn't differ too much. So that's one, could be that if you think about what was the very early life experience of that child, particularly if it was institutional rearing, it might not be optimal for that child's development. And we know severe deprivation in early childhood, we're talking really severe stuff, can lead to what's called a hyperkinetic reaction, which looks just like it's ADHD, it's just the same as ADHD. Could be very severe early rearing. If we also think about, sadly, some parents who might not be able to retain their kids, who might lose their kids. Some of those may have struggled with ADHD and/or substance misuse, and therefore that genetic liability might be there as well. So it could be, again, a very complex mixture of them both. Yeah, no, such a good question. So I'll show you these big numbers, these big fancy images, and we show some of it is that maybe one part of the brain is a tiny bit smaller at a group level. How does that go from there to the clinic? How does it help you treat kids with ADHD? So I can tell you how. It will eventually. It won't now. It won't now. Showing that now is not clinically useful. But what it might do is, take, for example, that finding that it's the deep information processing structure of the brain. What we also find is that the white matter things that grow out of it, the white matter tracts, they are perhaps a little bit less organized. So that might say, well, what would you expect in the processing style of the child that might reflect that? And actually what you expect from that model, and what you find, is that the problems in ADHD aren't so much with attention as they are with processing speed. That there is a sluggish processing speed and a highly variable processing speed. So there, neuroscience has shifted our look for psychological level problems a little bit, and that's actually been quite informative. So now I think most people would agree that if you have the biggest neuropsychological difference between kids with ADHD isn't pure attention, although they're there too, it's more things like visuospatial working memory and performance, processing speed, and the variability of processing speed. Part of that shift has been slightly informed by neuroscience imaging, partly. And what's nice about the neuroscience is that there are actually now predictions from neuroscience about what you would see in terms of psychological performance. And so processing speed is another good one. There's this very interesting called the resting state of the brain, which is, so whenever we are all bored, and you're all probably doing it right now, what happens is these parts of the brain shut down and the midline parts of the brain start firing in synchrony. And this is called the resting state of the brain. And it's great. What we do to evoke this is you bore someone. So you pop them in a scanner and you say, look at this little X for 5 minutes, and about a minute into it, and they're just in the middle, and it's pulsing. And you can find this in everyone. It's the resting state of the brain, the default mode. It's pretty reliable. You get it, these midline regions. The minute you start to do something, that shuts down, and these bits, the task active bits, take over. Okay? So there's actually an interesting theory about ADHD that maybe it's this resting state, this, is switching on when it shouldn't. It's interrupting ongoing processing. In fact, really, it was a theoretical idea, but someone tested it, and it was part of the story. So there you go. So there, the neuroimaging made a prediction, which they tested, which was partly correct. It's not the whole story, but it's partly correct. So that's the sort of short term. The longer term is the more we know about neurobiology, the better off we're going to be. Because it really will redirect our thinking. I think the biggest shift I can think of has actually been conduct disorder. So that super naughty children who invited, I think, moral disapproval and a lot of hits before. And you've got this fantastic neuroimaging science showing now that actually there's a problem with learning mechanisms, especially and that's just great. This is something it's a malleable target, and it's something you can do something about. Teach a kid that would hopefully have a trickle-down effect. So I think by redefining the neurobiology, we might start defining new targets. I think mainly in behavioral terms. An awful lot of people think in terms of if you get a genetic pathway, there might well be drug interventions for that pathway. So they're very famous examples for cholesterol. That's where they did some of these genetic studies. They found this gene, and then it turned out that it was on a pathway, and it happens. There's a drug, and you give it, and it's simvastatin. So and hence the statin story. So there are success stories that people think of. So that's how gene pathways might lead to targets. I don't think they have to be druggable. I think some of them will be, many of them won't be. But they might speak to pathways that are more amenable to behavioural intervention. But it's a great question. It's a great question. Oh, so the study is what is the impact on the developing brain of psychostimulant medication in particular? What is the impact? So there are now 7 or 8 studies. So most of them are the snapshot studies. And so what they've done is taken large groups of kids with ADHD, some unmedicated, never had any psychostimulant treatment, some who have, and then compared them to individuals who neither have ADHD or were never medicated. So by and large, those studies are all finding more or less this, for brain structure only, this is brain structure. For pretty much all of them, the kids in most brain regions, the 3 groups don't differ that much. If you have ADHD or not ADHD, that's the bigger difference. If you're medicated or not, there's a subtle difference. It tends to be that the group who are on medication do look a little bit more like the typical group, only a little bit. Now the thinking is, does that mean that psychostimulants are normalizing the brain? You can't really say that here because this isn't a trial. Because there could be lots of other reasons why those kids are on medication and those kids aren't. But certainly that theme is being found repeatedly. You can't take from that therefore stimulants make the brain better, but what the big impact of it was, I think, is just the fear that psychostimulants might at a structural level do something that was very bad hasn't been borne out. If there's a difference, it's ADHD and non-ADHD. Within those 2 groups, if there's a difference, it's a hint towards more typical stuff in the group who are medicated. Again, I wouldn't take causality from it. It doesn't mean it's causing it. To do that, what needs to be done is a trial. Where to flip it of a coin, individuals either go into the medication wing or not. And actually, one group is doing that at the minute in the Netherlands. So they'll report back on their study soon, actually. Again, great question. So, the very simple answer to that is sometimes these brain changes don't translate into something that's meaningful, and that they don't. Sometimes they don't. So in the study, there was a longitudinal study where there was a little bit of a hint that in one part of the brain just here, the kids who were on who started a psychostimulant as opposed to stopping it, sort of converged a little bit more. But actually in that study, there was no difference in functional outcome in that study. So generally, no, it doesn't always translate in a very obvious way. And remember, this is structure. This is structure. I think functional studies, where you look at brain function at the moment, much more informative on this point. So, for example, when we are doing structural imaging in kids, they watch a movie because it doesn't matter what you're doing because it's your brain structure. When you're doing functional imaging, it matters incredibly what you're doing because that's exactly what you're mapping. So we know, for example, that if you give kids, Katia Rabi has done most of this work in London, and it's very nice work. So if you give kids with ADHD, a difficult task that's very attention demanding, that, by definition, a lot of them make mistakes, and you will find that parts of the brain that are typically firing in synchro aren't. If they take their psychostimulant, if their behavior improves, that will come online. The minute it's out of the system, it goes away again. So, that's the sort of, but we know it's got to be, because their behavior, if the medication's working, it has to be doing something, and that's what you find. If it's off medication, it just goes back. It's not that it has a lingering effect. And that's the sort of thing about, why we need better treatments rather than just symptomatic relief. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what's the thought as to how the medications work? So the by far still the most commonly prescribed, for good reason, because it has the best evidence behind it, are psychostimulant medications. And psychostimulant medications are thought to act, and those deep structures of the brain, the thing I waved, so they're thought to act there.
Which is what, Adderall?
Yeah, so that's Adderall, Ritalin, all of those. Dexedrine, Vyvanse, all of those ones. The sort of the stimulant medication, the one you have to take every day. And what they do, two main modes of action. One of the class, there are two classes, but both of them seem to act on a chemical deep in the brain called dopamine. This is probably where they have their main action. And both of them have the net effect of transiently increasing the amount of dopamine that seems to be in these deep regions of the brain. And dopamine, if you like it, can be thought as a fuel for transmission of signals, so it boosts that. So one of them acts by blocking. So dopamine is produced by little cells, and it's sucked back up by this sucking up mechanism. So one of them blocks that mechanism, so it increases the amount of dopamine that's hovering around. And the other class of medication pushes more out. So one stops it being sucked up, the other pushes more out. So that's how we think they act. And I think there's an awful lot of truth in that, I think on longer term, the story will get more complicated, but that's certainly lots of good evidence that's how the stimulants work. Yeah, no, good question. Yeah. All the other things that boost dopamine. Yeah, firstly, they boost dopamine way too much and way too long. So no. And no, it's a really interesting question, actually, but no, they don't work, actually. So there you go. Yeah, you would have thought. So then there are other medications, like other ones which are thought to act more at the cortex. So we think stimulants act mainly deep. We think the other ones, like clonidine and Tenax and things like that, act more in the frontal parts of the brain on a different set of receptors called adrenal receptors, stimulating those. And there's good evidence that that is indeed what they're likely to do. So different classes of medication act somewhat different in different regions of the brain, somewhat different chemical families. Believe me, the full picture is going to be complicated. There are going to be lots of downstream effects of having dopamine, maybe on this little structure of cells and stuff like that. But that's how we think they act. I will add, as someone who has no pharmaceutical involvement at all, and I do stress this, the safety of stimulants has been extensively studied. They really are looked at so rigorously. So the FDA recently published this huge study whenever there was a fear about very serious cardiovascular events from ADHD, and this study had literally millions of years of treatment worth and there was no evidence of any increase of serious adverse cardiac events in kids. So what I can say is the best state of our knowledge, and these are some of the best, most scrutinized medications we have, stimulants, they have a good risk safety profile, and we know what to watch out for in these medications. The other medications are less well studied, like Strattera, for example. That's a newer medication. We just don't know as much about it. There doesn't seem to be, but we just don't know as much. It's not a controlled substance either, so the databases to really look at it don't exist. But really, stimulants have been looked at very extensively. They have a good, and if you have a kid who just has ADHD, a stimulant nearly always fine. If you have a kid who's ADHD plus, lots and lots of big long list of issues, really complex issues, I can tell you a psychostimulant alone will not work. You need a much more complex response if the child has complex problems. Yeah, so the question, another great question is, so kids with ADHD very, very frequently, and it's more than half actually, will have another problem. Those problems are often anxiety, oppositional problems, conduct problems, depression, learning difficulties, huge problems. What's their developmental course? Now, have we studied it? No, we really haven't. Because when these studies started back in the 90s, the emphasis then was on getting ADHD in isolation, really studying just ADHD. Because then, these are back in the days when people would say, oh, it doesn't even exist. So I think quite rightly the decision then was get the kids who are ADHD and not much else and see what happens there. So that gives you a very specific picture. It's not a very generalizable one because most kids have other things. So like everyone else now, we are a bit more of an all-comers. So we take kids with these. And like many people, what we're interested in is not so much the course of of an individual disorder, but the course of a symptom dimension. So if you take a kid, like say the symptom dimension might be problems with attention. That isn't specific to ADHD. Kids who are sad, who are anxious, lots of kids have problems with attention. It cuts across many different disorders. So a lot of people are thinking, well, let's look at it that way. Let's look at these key dimensions. Problems with attention would be one, problems with impulse control, problems with working memory, problems with and so on. Because we know they're present in various mixes and lots of problems. And instead of excluding children who are comorbid from research, these kids would actually be very much the focus of it in some ways, because they're a bit more representative. So that's the next wave of studies, is sort of moving away from, the DSM, the diagnostic manual, is great, and it allowed psychiatrists to talk to each other in a way they couldn't before. And it instituted very safe, rigorous ways of testing medications and making sure they're good for kids with identifiable problems. It is very unlikely the brain is divided into DSM chapters, very unlikely, especially the childhood brain. It's going to be very complex dimensions that unfold it. So that's what a lot of people, including ourselves, we study much more. Like I always keep a focus on the kids who have the most problems. And quite often they are the ones who easiest meet the category. So I always definitely weigh all research to that, because that's ultimately who we need to help. But to study it, a lot of people are looking at the dimensions, which includes all kids. So it's a great question. The way in which it's going to be answered is going to be different in the future, because it's going to be less about how each different category does, but how the undercutting dimensions do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So the question was the position of little kids who have mostly ADHD-like trajectories early in life. So I said that perhaps they're at a disadvantageous position in the rejection network. What about some of the other networks? The helping one and the bullying one and the victim one. And it's a complex story once you go. It really is. So if you look a bit more beyond ADHD to ADHD with oppositionality, that sort of flavour, those kids, very complicated position actually. So what we find is that actually the ones I found most was in some ways the bullying and victimization networks, in how much the overlap was of bullies and victims. I thought that was fascinating. Some of the kids who I think would struggle most actually inhabited both roles, which I thought was fascinating and makes perfect sense to me. So it was very, very, very complicated. And in the bullying victim one, it was a bit broader than ADHD. ODD and conduct disorder had a big impact on that one as well. And for the life of me, I can't remember the helping results at all. Just can't remember them. Where's Esther when I need her? But I don't know. There you go. Yeah, so the question is, why do some kids outgrow symptoms and others don't? Why do some remit and some do not? Some really continue to struggle. And the answer to that is going to be, again, there's these lovely, that's the what. We've got the where and the why, what, why did they do it? And so from the twin studies, again, I go back to twin studies, there have been lovely twin studies that have followed up twins as they have been growing up, really big twin studies. And they suggest that you have a bunch of genes that are likely to be important in the onset of ADHD, and you have a bunch of genes that are likely to be important on the developmental course of ADHD. And to be honest, I would have assumed they would have been the same, and they're not. They overlap a lot, but they're going to be somewhat different. So the answer is, part of it is definitely going to be something genetic. Those genes will partly overlap with the genes that are responsible for the onset of ADHD, and partly not. I think it's, it's about 60-40, something like that was their estimate. But so part of the answer will be, it's just part of it will be genetics. It will be that, some will, then part will be environmental. And that's going to be, your other 34. Which environments? Your guess would be as good as mine at the minute. I can hypothesize. I can think about the environments that we're particularly interested in. Like we're very interested, the peer context is an environmental one, which I think is, we look at that because it's near the child, it's meaningful to the child, and you can do something about it. There are other contexts that other people are fascinated in that we know have a big environmental impact on ADHD. The classic story is lead poisoning. That's just huge, 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 huge. If you have a certain level of lead, it is highly likely you're going to have ADHD and a terrible course. Beyond that environmental exposure, other ones are harder to parse out. So it's a great question. Do I know the answer? No. How we and others are going about trying to find the answer is with the individuals in this study, we follow people up over time. So for example, all the little kids in our study now, the 500 or 600, have all had genetics. And so we know bits about their genetic profile, and other centres across the world are also doing it, following people up as they grow up. And then eventually, once you get to a certain number, you can meaningfully say, is there anything genetically here that's useful, that we can intervene with, that is a determining cause? Everyone is measuring key environmental stuff. It's pretty limited. Our environmental measures are pretty limited, but everyone is looking at them. Like everyone is measuring prenatal environment, birth histories, and the family immediate context. And some of us are measuring peer environment, and some other groups are measuring environmental exposures. So that's how people are going about trying to answer it, but I don't know the answer. The long-term impact of medication and indeed of behavioural treatments, that's hard to assess. It really is hard to assess. What we can definitely say is that we know for up to 18 months, which is the longest trial, psychostimulants have a benefit. And because that's how long the randomised part, and then it was open treatment, and then it was sort of, then you returned to the community and you got treatment. And then it becomes much harder to truthfully say, well, that caused that, that caused that. We know definitely up to 18 months. And most people think beyond that, but we don't know. Up to 18 months, definitely. And for behavioural treatment, that's one of the biggest disappointments in the field at the minute, is that again, these meta-analyses where they add in the results of all the trials, there's an awful lot of trials on behavioural management, mainly parent training, and they didn't show much benefit. And the other one was cognitive stuff, and it was terribly disappointing, and it's the stuff I do all the time, and I was just, but there you go. So we do have to do better. Okay. Well, it exists in both. That I can tell you. Yeah, so there's good ADHD in boys, ADHD in girls. In terms of the prevalence, first of all, I think it is more common in little boys. I do. I think it's probably 2 to 3 to 1. Fascinatingly, that's not the case in adulthood when it's 50-50. I think that's unbelievable. We're missing a big clue there. I don't know why someone's research career isn't into this. There is a big clue there. I don't know any other problem that has such a big shift in its gender composition. That's either biology or social context or both, and it can't be that hard to parse that out. So there's a definite gender switch with your developmental stage. And in terms of the presentation, that's really complicated. There is this concept which I think who's detected, who's picked up. And the classic model is that little girls who are inattentive and not being disruptive are much, much more likely to be passed over in the classroom. And I think there might be some truth in that. I don't know. The really good studies to look at that have not been done. It is definitely easier to pick up someone who is disruptive. It is. Okay, I think one last, and then they're probably, because it's nearly 9 o'clock, you poor people, I don't want to keep you too long.
I had a question about the genetics.
Oh my goodness, this is like a, wow, you're like my board of scientific examiners. That's such a hard question. You're like, oh, I wanted someone to ask me, how do you spell Philip, 1L or 2? Oh goodness, oh goodness. So the question was really good. It was about like, woof. And I actually was asked that by my board of scientific examiners. So I'm not walking, I really was, and it was really difficult. I sort of looked there like a stunned rat, like, I don't know. So the question is, if you have a kid who has a known genetic problem, for example, Fragile X, does ADHD look different in that kid? Is that pretty much so that fascinating question.
Can we start by saying what's fragile?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so this would be, for example, if you have a genetic difference. So there are some genetic differences where, for example, if you imagine your genetic blueprint and either you have a big chunk of it that's missing, a chunk of it that's missing, or repeated, or expanded. And Fragile X would be one of the ones where your X chromosome is expanded. And often that leads to some problems, and it leads to problems with your learning and leads to some problems with your physical health. So that'd be Fragile X. And there are elevated rates of ADHD in kids, and does it look different? Perhaps a little bit more hyperkinesis. That's probably all I would say. We were actually trying to look at it systematically in individuals who have sex chromosomal differences. So instead of, the typical, or the most common pattern is XXXY, there are individuals who have XXY, XXYY, really elevated rates of ADHD. Does it present differently? In those individuals, actually, interestingly, there was more inattention, but that's all I could say. Cool. But on that note, I think it's already past 9 o'clock, so thank you very much.